So what we're going to do today is just talk about how to capture user input using JavaScript. And so some of this stuff will probably be a little bit familiar if you've created HTML elements, like maybe in P5 last semester or when you took MMP 210 before. But what we'll see is how to actually write it all out in JavaScript. So when we're using libraries, a lot of the time they're giving us little shortcuts for things, like when we do mouse pressed in P5, that's like a shortcut for using the native JavaScript events. And so part of what we're going to be doing in this lesson is just looking at how do we actually do that without the library. And it's pretty much the same. It doesn't really look that different, but there are some differences. So it's good to be kind of, aware of those differences. Um, and then beyond that, we'll just be looking at if a user is going to, type in their name or their password or give us some other type of information, how do we capture that information and then use it in our program. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, and we'll just kind of set up some basics. So for today, I'm not going to really do that much with styling or anything like that. We're just going to set up some basic HTML and JavaScript, and we'll add some more styles and stuff like that in later lessons to make it look a little bit better. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go over to Replit and create a new project. And I'm going to use the HTML, CSS, JavaScript template as usual. And I'm going to call this web app 1. I'll probably make a few different versions of this and create my new project. And so yeah, generate some stuff for us. We're going to get rid of a lot of the basic stuff in here. I'm going to go down to settings to start and just make my font size larger. And one of the nice things actually that they added recently to this interface is I can put multiple files into this panel here and move them around. So that way I don't actually have to keep opening up the file browser to change files. I can just click between these different tabs now, and then I can close them if I want to. So that's kind of nice. And so yeah, for this one, we should be able to do everything with the web view. I'll probably go to the publish page a couple times just to show certain things. But this is pretty good as far as what we need. And then I think I showed this like the first time that we used Replit, but they do have like a package manager in Replit, and there's actually some pretty useful packages when it comes to writing HTML and CSS. Um, Francis, can you mute? Thank you. Um, so one of the packages that you probably have seen before, if you've been writing HTML and CSS, is called Emmet. And if you just type in Emmet to packages and then just like click the plus button on here, it's going to add a lot of functionality that makes it faster to write HTML. So I'll occasionally use this if I'm trying to write something a little more quickly. And so an example of this is like if I wanted, there's this like generated page here for me, but if I wanted to start from scratch, I'm just going to delete everything on this page. This is a new thing. That's kind of funny. Um, with Emmet installed, there's a bunch of different shortcuts. So for example, if I type in HTML:5, this is going to generate a basic HTML template page for me. So that's actually really convenient because I can get started on an HTML project without having to like remember all this stuff and type in all this stuff. So that's pretty nice. And then all we have to do is go in here and edit the document. So I'm going to change this document to like web app demo. And it actually doesn't have a CSS link. So I'll have to add that at some point. I figured it would have one of those, but it doesn't. But that makes sense. It doesn't know if we have CSS, but we'll add that later. So then the only thing we really need now is just our content and connection to our script. So Emmet is really useful. There's a lot of like different like little shortcuts and stuff like that, but I'm not going to go over all of those right now. There's probably a page, Emmet shortcuts, cheat sheet. Yeah, this is a good page. So this will show you everything that you can do. So there's a lot of like little things that will save you time, like this is a good example. If I want to make like a navigation, I can type nav and then a angle bracket, and then I want a list in there, and then I want some list items, and I can actually say how many I want. Like I could say like times 5, and then I hit tab, and it just generates all that stuff for me. Although it didn't do the nav. Did I mess that up? Nav into, oh, that looks right. Huh, maybe it's just not implemented correctly. Anyway, you can do stuff like that. So there are other packages for like highlighting and a lot of different stuff that could be useful. But let's just get into writing some HTML. Um, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to write a bunch of HTML and then add some JavaScript. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of the different ways that you might approach making an application, and why certain ways are more advantageous than others. And then we'll write some code to go along with it. So what I'm going to do now, even though we're leading towards an interactive story, what I want to do is collect some information about my user. So I'm going to just get their name so I can use their name as they're telling a story. And then I'm gonna ask them for like, to identify some kind of type. So if you're playing like Dungeons and Dragons, or if you're playing a video game, a lot of the time you have to kind of like choose your like class, or choose like a type of character that you want to play. And so for this, I'm just using that as an example, but it's a good way to kind of show like something that you might put into a web form. So in a different type of setting, like if it was like something for school, it might ask you like, oh, are you a student from BMCC, or Kingsborough, or Hostos, or wherever, and then you could choose that, those options. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can kind of give information as users, and then there's different ways that as developers that we collect and store that information. Um, so let's start out by saying, we'll just add some basic content. So let's say I have this like interactive story, and I want to use the user's name in the story. So I'm going to say like, welcome to, I guess it's not welcome to my website if it's a story. What would I say? Like, welcome to, let's make up like a fake name for the setting of our story. So let's say welcome to, um, what can it be about? We can make it about like coding. So let's say welcome to coding land. And then we'll ask them for their name. So we'll say, please input your name. And so then after we have that, if I render this page, you can see we have this basic text. It's probably kind of small on here, so I'll open up another tab and kind of increase the size here. And so this is just our HTML, right? I've just added this content using HTML. There's no script at all right now. And so I can keep going like that, but at a certain point, it's going to be hard to keep adding more and more HTML, and we're going to realize that what we really need to do is use a script to make it a little bit easier. But let's keep going until we get to that point. So now I have to add an input. I'm just going to add a basic generic input here. So when I add an input tag in HTML, maybe you guys have written these before. It's just a little text input where I can type in text and we can save that text in JavaScript. So let's put a couple things in here. Let's give it a placeholder so we can say, say name here. So that shows them where to put their name. And then we need to, for later, we're going to need this to get this into our code. We need to give this box an ID so that we, are able to reference it in our code. So an ID, you probably remember this from learning HTML and JavaScript. An ID is something that an element can have that we can use to style it, but we can also use to get it in our code in JavaScript. So let's give this an ID. We'll call it name input. So that way, when we write a script, we'll be able to find where they've input their name. And then we also need to give them a way to submit. So they need to type in the name, and they could just hit enter, but usually we have like a little button. So we can put a button here, and just put submit. So they have something to click when they're done typing. So this is kind of just like a basic form. I can put my name and then click submit. And we could also connect the code so that it'll listen if I just hit enter, if that's appropriate. But these are usually like, some basic elements that we would want to have. Okay, so now I'm gonna kind of write some stuff that we're gonna end up going back a little bit and changing. But I just want to kind of like walk through how this would work. So let's imagine that in this sort of like steps of our web application, we want to start by getting their name, and then we want to go to a new page where we can get more information about them. So, that's kind of typical a lot of times these days when you're signing into an application, it'll say, oh, what's your username? And then if your username exists, it'll take you to another page where you put in your password. And so you could create like multiple HTML pages to do this, but then you have to create scripts for all those HTML pages, and you just have a ton of files. So what most websites do is they have what's this kind of web app architecture where instead of generating, having a million different HTML pages with like one question, we're using JavaScript to organize the content on the page, and we're like changing and moving the content around depending on what information we're looking for. So the way that we might do that is we might say, once I click this button, just make this stuff disappear, and then we'll go to this next section. Whoops. And we'll have a new paragraph that says, enter your character type. And we'll have a new input. But for this one, actually, maybe we won't use an input. Maybe we'll give them some options. So we can use a select for this. So I'll use a select. And a select is basically just like a drop down. So a select, we can give it an ID. We can say character type. And then a select has options. So inside of our select element, we have an option. Let's say we have a designer option. We have a front end option. We have a, oops. The one problem with Emmet is if I am typing all this stuff and then I spell it wrong, it makes wrong versions of this. We could have a backend developer. We could have a UX designer. We could have what else might we need? That's good enough. We can stick with that for now. And so now when I render this page, now we have this like little drop down. And so if I wanted to, I could write in my code, once they finish this part, let's get rid of this. And then let's change to this. But then you could start to see that creates this issue where every time I want to do something new, I need like this whole section. And I'm going to have to make that section disappear and bring in this new section. So one way of dealing with that problem is instead of having like multiple paragraphs that we want to introduce, we could have one paragraph, and we could use JavaScript to change the text of that paragraph and show different items and collect information in different ways. So doing that is going to make it a lot easier to design our web app. We'd also need another button down here. So I'd need like a whole other button here, and I'd have to get a reference to that button in JavaScript as a separate button. So you're going to see that there's different ways to do this. There's no one perfect way to do this, but as we need to collect more information and have our application do more things, it's easier a lot of the time to use JavaScript to change the values that we see on the page instead of writing everything in HTML and then using JavaScript to parse out what we want to see at different times. So again, there's no one right way to do this. But as we start to notice, like, I don't want to have to write a million different buttons and have a million different buttons that just say submit and then have those buttons, referenced in my script. Like, that's going to take forever. So why don't I just have one button and call it ID submit, and I'll just change what it says above the button. So let's get rid of this other button down here. And we don't need this paragraph. We can just change the text of the other paragraph. So let's do that in JavaScript instead of in our HTML. So instead, I'll change this paragraph. I'll give it an ID that says like message. And we'll just change the message. Instead of adding a new paragraph, I'll change this paragraph's message in JavaScript. With our name input, we can change this as well. We may need to do different things with this, but let's just change this to something more generic for now. Let's call this a text input. So if we want to get other information later, we'll just change this message, and whatever they put into the input, we'll grab that. Our select is a little bit different. We could actually build this in JavaScript, but since we know what it's supposed to look like, let's just leave it like that, and we'll turn this one on and off. So that one, it'll be a little bit more similar to kind of a default way of doing this. So let's reorganize this a little bit. And so now we have this little form that says, welcome to Coding Land, please input your name. We have their name. Then we have the type that we're going to add in a second. And then we're going to do our submit button here. So now we've got enough HTML to kind of get started. Let's go over to our script and connect everything so we can read it in our code, and then kind of update our user with some new information once we get that information. So let's move on to the script. Any questions before we move over to our script on the HTML stuff? Okay. Hopefully, I don't know if you guys have seen this type of HTML stuff before in previous classes. Maybe you have, but it's not probably what you would learn in like MMP 100 or whatever, but hopefully it makes sense. These are just some different types of inputs. So one thing that we do need to add before we go over to our script is a reference to our script. So let's put our script and just say source, and it's just script.js. We're just going to use the one that they created for us, and then we'll just close that script tag. And so now we should be able to go over to our script and start connecting things up. And so I'm going to go over to script. Another thing that's kind of nice about this view is I can actually throw my script over here. And so now I can actually look at my script and my HTML at the same time, which is going to be useful for a couple things that I want to do. So let's look at this view for a second. So here's our script. We're just going to get started with writing our code. The first thing that we need to do is get references to our HTML. So we're going to get references to the HTML. And what this means is I'm taking JavaScript and I'm saying like, find this HTML element on the page, and we're either going to get information out of it or we're going to change information inside of it. So let's start by getting a reference to our little message here. This is the message. This is just a paragraph that we're going to use throughout our application to give information to our user. So I'm going to use a constant here because I don't think I'm going to change this. If I need to change it in the future, we can change this to a let. And I'm just going to call this message on the JavaScript as well. So I'm just matching this to the ID. I think that's fine. You might want to call it like message paragraph or something like that. But for now, I don't think there's anything else that we're going to use like this. So I'm just going to call it message just to be a little bit simpler. And here's how I get a reference to my HTML. I'm going to use document. So document is a document object model. Let's actually look at that real quick. I'm going to close these. Okay, so if I go over to my console in the browser and I just type in document, this is going to show me all of the HTML on the page. So you can see this head section here. All of this stuff is just, meta information that we don't see on the page. And then in the body section, there's our paragraph. You can see, it looks exactly like the HTML that we just wrote. Here's our input. Here's our select. Here's our submit button and the script itself. So when I type in document, this is just like the main object that JavaScript uses to organize all of the content in our HTML page. And then document has a bunch of things associated with it. So if I say document and then I write a dot, it gives me all this information that's related to the document. So for example, document.location. This tells me like the URL of my page. So you can see the href here, origin, path, all of this different stuff. And then there's methods as well. So what we're going to use is document.getElement by ID, and we're going to use the ID message. And so that's just going to give us a reference to this HTML message, this HTML element on our page. So this is kind of a long function name, JavaScript tends to be kind of verbose. So it's like very specific about what it's doing. It's getting an element using the ID of the element. And that's how most of this JavaScript stuff looks. In P5 and some of the other languages, they don't, it's kind of annoying to have to write out this whole thing. So one of the things that they usually will do for us, P5 has something that's like create element. So they'll shorten things instead of, having this whole long thing. Anyway, so let's get our message. So we're going to say document.get element by ID. And notice it's camel case, but there's a bunch of words in here. So that's why there's so many capital letters. Get is lowercase because it's the first word. Element is the second word. It's capitalized. By is the third word, also capitalized. And then ID is also capitalized. So that's how JavaScript is supposed to look. There's some times where it doesn't look like that, but that's generally what it's going to look like. So then we just put in the ID of the element that we want to get. So this message matches this message. And once we have a reference, we can change things about that element with our code. So I'm going to console.log the message, and let's reload this. So there's my paragraph message, and you can see again inside the message, there's all these different pieces of information, and one of them, all the way down here, after all these events and stuff like that, there's one down here called text content. That's what's actually on the page. And we can change that just using our code. So we can say, and I'm going to take this off, but I'm just going to show this as an example, message.textcontent equals hello. Oops, semicolon. And so this is going to change our paragraph to hello. So that's not that exciting, but it does show us that we can actually change the text on the page using code. So we can wait for user input, we can get the username and all that stuff, and then put it on the page. So that's what we're going to do by the end of this little demo. So we've got our message. Now we need a reference to our text input right here. So I'm going to say const text input. And this is going to look exactly the same way. A lot of JavaScript documents have just a million of these at the very beginning because we're getting references to all of our elements. So the next one is text-input. This is another thing that's a little bit different with CSS and JavaScript. In CSS, you could actually name this text input like you would in JavaScript with camel case. That's not the convention. CSS, for whatever reason, the convention is to use a dash and all lower cases. This is just, convention from the history of people who wrote CSS. There's no real reason for this. It's just a kind of a preference. But that's one thing that you'll see a lot. And again, you can write this however you want. I could write this like this, and then it would look the same over here. But generally, the convention is that CSS, we use a dash and all lowercase letters, whereas in JavaScript, when we have two words together, we use camel case. So we have a lowercase letter for the first word, capital letter for the second word. So you'll see a lot of things that look like this, where it's like this is the same series of letters as this one, but they look a little bit different. So we have our text input. Let's get a reference to our character type. So we have character type equals document.get element by ID, character type. And this is a nice, in Replit and a lot of editors, like if you're on your computer, like Sublime or whatever, it's nice to be able to put the scripts next to each other because I can look and make sure that this matches this exactly. If I was off by even like a character here, then this code wouldn't work. It would give me an error. So then I only have one more thing left. It's my submit button. So we'll say constant submit button equals document.get element by ID, and the ID for this is submit. And so that should be everything. Let's make sure these all work. So I'm going to go to console.log, message, text input, character type, and submit button. And when we look in our log, in our console, you can see we're getting all of these guys. And if I look at these, if I open these up, so here's my message, my text input, my character type. They all look the same, but they have some differences. So let's look at the text input. And somewhere in here, it'll show me where it is on the page. Not there. That's the previous element. Huh. Where's the actual HTML? That's the next sibling. There's too many things in here. Didn't used to be quite. Here it is. Okay. Oh no, that's the next sibling. That's the body. Uh, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't see it in here, but we know that this is a reference to our text input. And then we have our character type and our submit button. So now we can actually get some information from the user. So let's go back to our script. So now I can switch back to, I don't really need to see all this stuff because I've got everything up here. So let's just go back to the view I had with the little preview window. Where's that? Docs, chat, shell. I don't see it here. If I do that, it'll probably come up. Okay, there's my web view. Okay, so now we can just focus on our script. So what we want to do is find out what the name of the person is, the user, once they click on the submit button. So there's a couple things we have to do in here to learn about with JavaScript getting events and getting values. So the first one is an event. Okay, so JavaScript events. So events are anytime that we interact with the page. So if we click on a button, if we scroll, if we move the mouse, if we type on our keyboard, all of those things are captured as events. And so what we want to do to start is connect an event to our submit button that we want to run when the user clicks submit. So this is also very verbose, but it just looks like this. I say submit button, and then I say add event listener. And an event listener is, I think actually we talked about this when we were doing Three.js, but an event listener is just like a little bit of code that's running in the browser that's basically constantly checking to see if a button is being clicked on. And if it is being clicked on, then it tells us. So we want to see if the button is clicked on. And if it is clicked on, we want to run a function, which is called a callback function. So we're going to run a function called get name. And we may have to make this more generic later, but let's go with that for now. So actually, we are going to have to make it more generic because we're going to get the character type too. So let's say on submit. So this is another way of saying like on when we click the submit button. So this is called a callback or a handler function. Let's say on submit, and then we can just run some code when we click on that button. So let's just test it first. I'm going to say console.log submit. So this should happen when I click the submit button. So let's refresh this. And so now I'm going to click submit. And there we go. We see anytime I click this, it's going to log submit here. But what we really want to know is the name that our user put in here. So there's another way we can do that. We can say text input, and then we can get the value out of it. So if I just log the text input, we'll see again, it's this whole thing. But if I want to know what's in there, I can say text input.value. And so now when I submit, oh, maybe it didn't save. Let's try that again. Okay, well, it's not showing anything because there is no value. So let's type something in. There we go. So now if I type in a name, we can see what the value of that text is. So that gives us this ability to record our user input. So we're going to capture other things with this text input. So if once we type something else in there, this text input dot value is going to go away. So what we want to do is save the user name. So we need some variables to do that. So there's different places we could put this. Let's just put it under these variables. So let's say let user name, and we don't know what the username is to begin with. So I'm just going to put a semicolon here. We're just going to declare it. And so then when we submit, I'm going to say username dot, equals text input dot value. And then I'm going to say something to the user. So I'm going to say, let's say, let's create our string first. So let's say greeting equals welcome, and then plus user name. And then after that, actually, let's end there. And then I'm going to add another string plus. So let's put a period at the end of the username and put a space here. Formatting the string is a little bit weird in this case because we have to add this variable inside these other strings. But let's just say select your character. So this is the next step in our web app. And we're going to have to make this a lot more sophisticated next time, but for now we're just going to start out simple. Um, then we are going to set the message to that greeting. So we're going to say message.textContent equals greeting. And so that should be our first little step. So now if I type in my name and I click submit, notice that the message up here changes. It says welcome Owen, so that's me. It knows who I am. So we're kind of convincing the user that the computer is working and it knows what's going on. And then it says select your character. Let's change this into a colon. And let's go over here. So I'm going to say submit, and it says welcome Owen, select your character. And so now this is when we want this to go away and this to appear. So that's the other thing that we're going to do here. And I think that'll be enough to get started. We'll have to make this a little bit nicer later. But so with JavaScript, we can also change styling. And we haven't done any CSS yet. We'll do a little bit of that later. But for now, we can actually just directly change things using CSS in JavaScript. So when I first start, I don't want this character type thing to be visible. So this is one of the first things I'm going to do after I declare my variables. I'm going to say, let's hide character type because I don't need it right now. So I'm going to say character type. And then if I want to reference the style of an element, I just say dot style. And then there's a few different ways I can do this. I can say set property here. That's probably the best way to do it. I could also say something like this, like style dot display equals none. But then you have to remember all the formatting issues. Like if you have background color, you have to kind of convert between CSS and JavaScript, which looks weird. If we can avoid doing that, we should. So let's look it up. I just want to double check. So JavaScript style set property. Yeah, it's just set property. So this will make it look more like what we're used to with CSS, although there's multiple ways to do this. So I can say style.set property. The property I want to set is actually the display. I don't want it to be displayed. So I'm setting the display to none. So I'm saying character type, this is my little drop down here. And then I'm referencing the style, so I just say dot style. And then I want to set a property, so I'm saying dot set property. And the first argument is the property that I want to set. And the second argument is the value that I want to set it to. And so if I run this, now our designer disappears when we run our code again. And we kind of see it real quick. So probably a better solution for this is to put that in the CSS so that we don't actually see it right away. But that's really just for this first one because we're rendering the page before we get to our code. So it would actually be better to put that in the style. Let's actually do that because it looks kind of funky and we haven't added our style yet. So that's a good chance to do this. So let's take a break here. Let's say this should go in style, but it's good to know how that works. Let's go back to index.html. We have to actually reference our style sheet. So hopefully you guys remember this. We use a link tag with a href set to style.css. And then we have to give it a a rel, which is the relationship is a style sheet. And we have to give it a type, which is text/CSS. Hopefully you You guys have seen that before. And so now this will load our CSS. There's some default CSS in here. We can just leave it there. It doesn't really matter. What we want to do now is just like we're getting a reference to our character type using a script, if we want to do that in CSS, for ID, we use the hashtag. So we have hashtag character dash type, and we're just going to say display none to start. So that way it's not going to appear at the beginning of our, when we first load our thing. Although it kind of looks like it's still doing that. No, not over here. Okay, so this one must be cached. Okay, so now we just see the name and submit. And now what we can do is we can hide our text input, at least for now, and show our character type. So this is a way that we can use our JavaScript to change the interface that our user is going to see. So back to on submit, once we kind of greet the user, we're going to say, we're going to get rid of our text input for a second because we want to use our select. So we're going to say text input dot style dot set property. And there's actually other more sophisticated ways of doing this as well that we're going to go over in a bit. But for now, let's just use the basic. So we're going to set the property display to none. And now we're going to show our select. So we'll say character type dot style dot set property display. Here's where we have to actually know what type of display we want to use, which is that part is a little annoying, but I think what I want to use is inline because I don't want it to take up its own page. I want it to sit next to the button. But depending on what your style is, you might want different things here. So let's save this, and I think it should run correctly. So let's put in the name, and I'm going to click submit. And now it says, welcome Owen, select your character. And so I have a character option, and then I can click submit again. So this is where it's going to get a little trickier. And in future lessons, we're going to get into better ways of handling this. But you'll notice that we still have the same submit button. So if I click submit again, we're just going to go back here. We're going to do the same thing again. So if I click submit here, nothing changes. So now what I need to do is start creating a sequence of going from one element to the next. And anything that I do at this point using what we've covered so far is going to be pretty basic. So we're going to skip that for now. We're going to pick up with that on Wednesday and talk about how to organize the data, how to organize the sequence that we want to go through as we build this project. But for now, this should be enough to get started, just kind of adding some stuff in here. And you can start to think about, if you want to do a different type of story, what kind of things you would want to add in here. So you can change the content. You can change the, where'd my HTML file go? Uh-oh. You can change the original message. You could change the inputs. You could change, different components that we're gonna collect from our user as we go through this project. Okay, so that's a good enough to get started. I'm gonna put a link to this in the voice chat, and we'll pick up from here on Wednesday. So if you guys have questions on this that you want to cover, we can go over it. If you have questions on other things that you're working on, we can go over that as well. Oh, Janine had a question about her project, so we can do that first. But if other people have questions, let me know. If you're still working on one of the sound projects or something else, we can take a look at it. So let me stop recording and then we